Hey everyone, Noah Zerby here. This is one of a series of short videos where we examine theories and issues in global politics. This video focuses in particular on the problem of rationality in international relations. It's a follow-up video to the shorter video on the Monty Hall problem, so if you haven't seen that video yet, I encourage you to go back and start there. Otherwise, let's get started. Now, remember that many models of foreign policy decision-making and theoretical models of international relations more broadly begin by assuming we have rational actors. What does that mean? Simple. We tend to think of decision-makers as sitting in a room weighing the costs and benefits of the various choices in front of them. Our models even sometimes assume that they have perfect information, that is, that they know everything about all of the options before them. After carefully evaluating their options, they select the one that provides the greatest benefit at the lowest cost and move forward to implement it. But I want to make the case here that this model doesn't actually reflect reality. We don't know what the options before us are. We don't necessarily know the true costs and benefits, and we can't calculate them accurately. And even if we could, the heuristics we use in decision-making sometimes lead us to make poor decisions. So let's briefly consider some of the challenges to rationality in decision-making. We've already looked at the problem of the endowment effect and the fact that people are poor judges of risk and reward in another video. In this video, I want to consider some of the other issues we face in rational decision-making. The first of these is called prospect theory. Prospect theory tells us that we as individuals have a tendency to value and to react to potential losses and gains in very different ways. If we were truly rational actors, we should have consistent attitudes towards risk, but we don't. This is the realm of prospect theory, and there's a couple of ways that this plays out. Imagine that I tell you we're going to flip a coin, and if it comes up tails, you're going to lose $10. Then I ask, how much would you have to win if it comes up heads to take that bet? What would you say? In theory, the answer should be something really close to $10. But when the experiment is run, the answer we usually come up with is around $20. Why? It's simple loss aversion. We're more afraid of losing something we already have than we are excited about the possibility of gaining something we don't. And coincidentally, this also explains why we have a hard time of getting rid of old things, why we stay in relationships past when we should probably leave, and so on. Policymakers also tend to act differently when assessing differences between relative gains and relative losses. Specifically, according to prospect theory, people tend to be more risk-adverse when operating in a world of gains, and more risk-loving or risk-embracing when operating in a world of potential losses. Consider the following hypothetical example. The zombie apocalypse has occurred. You're the president, and your science advisors say we have a choice in the development of 2 new anti-zombie weapons. We can develop a weapon that will kill 500 zombies at a time, or we can develop a weapon that has a 50% chance of killing 100 zombies and a 50% chance of killing 1,000 zombies. Which would you advise to choose, and why? Or let's consider a slightly different choice. You're still the president, and your science advisor has some bad news. You're stuck between 2 options. You now face the choice between 2 decisions, each of which will increase the zombie population. Your first option will generate 500 new zombies, but your second has a 50% chance of creating 100 new zombies and a 50% chance of creating 1,000 new zombies. Again, which do you choose and why? In the first case, studies show us that in the first scenario about how many zombies to kill, most people will choose option A. And in the second scenario about how many zombies we create, most people will choose option B. But are those optimal choices? No, they're not. Given the first decision, statistically, we're basically choosing between destroying 500 zombies with option A or 550 statistically with option B. Option B thus generates the better expected value on average. Yet numerous experiments show that when people choose between a guaranteed prize and a lottery offering a higher expected value, they disproportionately choose the sure thing. And what about our second example, creating new zombies? Here, the better value proposition is option A, but people disproportionately choose option B. Again, statistically, it's a choice between, on average, creating 500 new zombies with option A or 550 new zombies with option B. If people must choose between a sure loss or a lottery in which the expected value is worse, but the possibility exists of returning to the status quo, studies show they'll generally gamble in favor of a return to the status quo. The policy implications of prospect theory should be clear. Compared to the status quo, individuals will act in a more cautious, risk-adverse manner when they believe they're gaining ground, but when they perceive themselves as losing ground, individuals are more willing to take risky gambits in an effort to resuscitate their fortunes. Prospect theory tends to lead to a hawk bias in foreign policy. Put simply, the hawk bias asserts that when confronted with a possible adversary, the psychological response by individual policymakers will tend to lead to more confrontational policies. Aggressive actions will be interpreted as intentional. And as we learned from prospect theory, when threatened with a possible loss, policymakers will be more willing to take risky actions to preserve the status quo. Other psychological traits, such as an optimism bias and the illusion of control, tend to reinforce aggressive policies. Leaders will be supremely confident that proactive measures can address and mitigate whatever threat emerges. Related to the idea of prospect theory is the concept of the discount rate. Put simply, the discount rate is the idea that we tend to value things in the immediate present more than we value things that we'll get in the future. The classic adage of a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush is an example of this. It's also the root of procrastination. We tend to value our free time today more than we value our free time tomorrow. And it's at the heart of our instant gratification, credit card debt-fueled spending. Numerous studies show that we value immediate gratification over future gratification. In one experiment, researchers offered participants $100 now or $120 in a month. Most take the $100 now. But the discount rate has important implications in global politics. In the arena of foreign policy, decision makers are likely to focus on short-term gains over long-term gains, even where the long-term gains may be preferable. The discount rate also has critical implications for environmental policy. We're likely to avoid taking costly action today if we can push action off into the future, even if such action would be more effective if it were taken today. We also tend to value resources consumed now at a greater value than resources saved for the future. Decisions are also sometimes the result of path dependency. Put simply, path dependency is the idea that each decision puts you in a position that limits your future choices. In its most basic formulation, it's the idea that history matters. But it's also more than that. Institutions and existing technologies can constrain our choices, and we often take the world around us as limiting factors. We begin with assumptions that also limit our choices, frequently failing to learn from past mistakes. Decision makers may also be risk-adverse, further limiting their creativity. Here's a very simplistic example. Think of the QWERTY keyboard. The keyboard was designed as part of an early typewriter by Christopher Sholes in the 1870s. Why are the keys laid out as they are? They don't make intuitive sense, and the layout actually puts many of the most frequently used keys, like E, I, O, and U, outside the natural position where your fingers rest. It's almost as if it was designed to make typing more difficult. And in one sense it was. Early typewriters were mechanical devices, and if you typed sequential letters too quickly, they would jam. So the most frequently used keys and the most frequently used letter combinations like S and T had to be placed further away from one another so that the machines wouldn't jam. But there's a better way. The Dvorak keyboard places most commonly used letters close to your finger resting points. By most metrics, the Dvorak keyboard is demonstrably better. The most commonly used letters are placed directly under your finger's resting positions, and the most commonly used letter combinations, like ST or ED, are typed using keystrokes that alternate between left and right hands, creating a natural flow to the typing process. According to its proponents, using the Dvorak keyboard instead of the QWERTY keyboard improves typing speed, reduces the risk of errors made while typing, and reduces repetitive strain motion. And yet most of us have never typed on a Dvorak keyboard. Why are they so uncommon? It's largely a function of path dependency. By the time electric keyboards and later computers were developed, the QWERTY keyboard was dominant, and indeed it was the default option. Changing would have required an incredible investment of monetary and personnel resources. It was basically easier to keep the existing framework rather than to change it. A decision made in the past limited our current available options. But what does this have to do with international relations? Actually, quite a good deal. Every crisis involves decisions made by national leaders on how to interpret the decisions made by the other side and how to respond to those moves. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, XCOM had to interpret Soviet moves, read their intentions, and make decisions on how to respond, and the Soviets were doing the same thing. This opened a lot of room for miscalculation, misinterpretation, and missed opportunities. Or think of the fictional example taken from the film The Sum of All Fears, based on a Tom Clancy novel of the same name. The film centers on a plot by far-right nationalists to spark a nuclear war between the United States and the Soviet Union. It's up to our protagonist, CIA analyst Jack Ryan, to prevent this from happening. In the film, far-right nationalists acquire a nuclear device which they explode at the Super Bowl. A Russian general in command of an airbase and who's in league with the terrorists tells his air squadron that the Americans have attacked Moscow and orders them to sink an American aircraft carrier group in the North Sea. Although the Russian president denies knowledge of either attack, the Americans don't believe him, and the U.S. president orders a retaliatory strike against the Russian airbase. Advisors to the Russian president are urging him to follow their standard operating procedure and strike against U.S. forces at NORAD. Meanwhile, the American president orders American nuclear forces on full alert. The U.S. launches several B-2 stealth bombers from bases in Italy, which Russia interprets as an escalation of the crisis. Now in the film, just as each side escalates according to normal procedure, each is interpreting the actions of the other in the worst possible light. Fortunately, Ryan saves the day. He violates a presidential order and standard operating procedure by communicating directly with the Russian president. He urges him to back down, telling him, quote, "This no longer has anything to do with Baltimore, where the site of the first attack. Now it's about fear, our fear of your missiles, your fear of our subs, fear of being weak or of making a mistake." And the Russian president does. Trusting Ryan, he orders the Russian strategic forces to stand down, although they maintain defensive alert. The U.S. president has 30 seconds to reverse his launch sequence to avert an all-out nuclear war and to begin a phased mutual stand-down over several hours. The day is saved. So how does this hypothetical example illustrate the problem of path dependence? After the nuclear warhead is detonated at the Super Bowl in Baltimore and the rogue Russian general strikes against the U.S. carrier group, the U.S. president has several options. He could do nothing. He could let diplomacy play out. He could order a limited strike in response to the attack. He could escalate through a larger strike, or he could even launch a full-scale nuclear response against the Soviet Union. Now, each of these options would have costs. They're clearly not all appropriate or viable responses. How would the U.S. population respond to a president who does nothing after the U.S. is attacked with a nuclear weapon? How would the Russians respond to a full-scale nuclear attack against them? Importantly, once a decision is made, that decision limits our future choices, path dependency. If the U.S. president launches a full-scale nuclear strike, diplomacy is pretty much done. And the Russian president faces a similar set of responses and similar challenges in developing that response. After the U.S. destroys a Russian airbase, how should he respond? With diplomacy, a proportionate response, an escalatory response, do nothing? Remember that he too faces domestic political pressures, and these limit his choices in the film. And like the US president, he also faces the problem of limited information. He doesn't know about the rogue Russian general's airstrike. From his perspective, the US was responding to a terrorist attack against Baltimore by destroying a Russian airbase. How does that play with the Russian generals, or his political rivals, or the Russian public? This is the challenge of path dependence. Once we get started down a particular path, we tend to remain on that path until something or someone pushes us off of it. Now, the next concept I want to briefly mention relates to the idea of path dependence, and I've already alluded to it when I said that decision makers are forced to operate with imperfect information. And that's the concept of bounded rationality. Put simply, bounded rationality is the idea that the rationality of decision makers is limited or bounded by limited information available to them, individual cognitive limitations, and the finite time usually available to decision makers, particularly during a crisis. Bounded rationality emerged in the 1950s as a response to conventional economic models which assume perfect rationality and perfect information. That is, that everyone knew everything about everything, and that we all engaged in a perfect cost-benefit analysis using that information available to us. Behavioral economics came along and said, well, that's just not true. And what happens when we relax those assumptions? In the context of bounded rationality, we can no longer strive for the best decision or the best outcome. Instead, we seek to arrive at a satisfactory choice among the limited options available to us. This process is called satisficing, a combination of satisfy and suffice. We aim to arrive not at the optimal outcome, but one that is satisfactory. The theorist who developed the idea was Herbert Simon, and he won the Nobel Prize in Economics for the critique. In his acceptance speech in 1978, Simon summarized bounded rationality as this. He said, quote, "Decision makers can either satisfice either by finding optimum solutions in a simplified world or by finding satisfactory solutions to a more realistic world." Indeed, one criticism of the mainstream field of economics is that it's focused too much on the former and not enough on the latter. Now, leaders are forced to do this all the time. But what's interesting is that there's a considerable amount of research concluding that people who adopt a strategy of satisficing rather than maximizing in their daily lives are actually happier than those that don't. Finally, let's consider the problem of groupthink. Put simply, groupthink is the phenomenon that arises when a group of people's desire for harmony or cohesiveness results in an irrational or a dysfunctional decision-making outcome. The concept was first articulated by psychologist Irving Janis in the early 1970s, but has been applied to a whole variety of cases, including the December 7, 1941 Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. There, American officials had intercepted communiques that Japan had armed itself for an attack somewhere in the Pacific Ocean, but warnings that the attack may take at Pearl Harbor were dismissed as unlikely. Or the April 1961 Bay of Pigs, when the U.S. launched an attack using Cuban exiles intended to overthrow the Castro regime in Cuba. In the lead-up to that attack, President Kennedy uncritically accepted assessment by the Central Intelligence Agency, and those who objected, including people like Arthur Schlesinger and William Fulbright, eventually minimized their own doubts and began to self-censor concerns about the attack. Or even the 2003 U.S. invasion of Iraq. The administration had come to believe that Saddam Hussein was in the possession of weapons of mass destruction, even though there was little evidence that this was the case, and opposition to that idea was not expressed within the administration. Let's consider the Bay of Pigs in slightly more detail. In April of 1961, a group of 1,500 Cuban exiles, with training and support from the United States, launched an invasion intended to overthrow the communist government of Cuba. That mission, called the Bay of Pigs, was a total disaster for the United States. Less than 72 hours after the attack was launched, it was defeated. And as a result of the attack, Fidel Castro's position as the leader of Cuba was strengthened, and Cuba moved more fully into the Soviet sphere of influence. It's also widely believed that the failed Bay of Pigs invasion was one of the proximate causes of the Cuban Missile Crisis, pushing the Soviet Union to station nuclear missiles on the island to dissuade another American attack. An analysis of the decision-making process leading up to the Bay of Pigs invasion showed that it had all the hallmarks of groupthink. The Central Intelligence Agency dominated discussions and dismissed criticisms or questions. They engaged in wishful thinking about the likelihood of military success and the support of the Cuban population after the invasion. And as a result, they were poorly prepared when things began to go poorly. Now, what's interesting about this is that President Kennedy recognized the problems of groupthink that led to the disaster of the Bay of Pigs. So in 1962, when the Cuban Missile Crisis occurred, he explicitly evoked many of Janis's principles to avoid the problem of groupthink in XCOM, a process he referred to as vigilant appraisal. During the meetings of XCOM, Kennedy invited in outside experts to share their viewpoints and allowed group members to question them carefully. He encouraged group members to discuss possible solutions with trusted members within their separate departments, and even divided the group into various subgroups to partially break up group cohesion. And Kennedy himself was deliberately absent from the meetings so as to avoid pressing his own opinions or influencing the discussions. As a result, the committee was fully able to consider a wider array of policy options and wound up arriving at a fairly unconventional solution, which we explore in more detail in a different video. So that concludes our overview of the problem of rationality in international relations. I hope you found it interesting and useful. Thanks for watching.